This is the recording for the Chapter 6 homework explanation, and I'll actually switch over and do all of this in Lucidchart. So I think it's the screen here. There we go. Okay. Trying to figure out how to do this. The easiest way to do this would be to kind of just talk through the problems and do more of an ERD in Lucidchart, because I think that I think it's easier to explain that way. So that's the way I'm going to do it. So I'll start with number 1 in chapter 6. It says use the descriptions of the attributes, convert the ERD into a dependency diagram that's in at least third normal form. So I'll explain what depends on what and why. So that's kind of the dependency diagram there, and what should depend on what. So right now we've got two entities. We've got the appointment entity, and we've got the doctor entity. I think we're going to end up with at least one more entity when we're done here. So let's look at the doctor first. So the doctor entity's got his employee ID, the first name, last name, and the cell phone. For this one, this entity is actually pretty good, because if you've got the doctor's employee ID, that completely determines the first name, the last name, and the cell phone number. So for a dependency diagram, those three attributes would all depend on the doctor's employee ID. So that one's good. Now let's look in the appointment entity here. The appointment entity's primary key is the appointment number, and then we've got a foreign key of the doctor's employee ID. So that's good, because it is a one-to-many relationship, and I'll draw that here. So between doctor and appointment. Okay, so it's got appointment number, appointment time, appointment patient ID, appointment name. Okay, now that's where we start getting into trouble. There is a transitive dependency between appointment patient ID and appointment name, because the patient ID is the ID number of the patient, and the name is the name of the patient. So really, the patient ID determines the patient's name. So what we need to do is separate that out and get one more entity over here for patient, and that's again going to be a one-to-many relationship, which actually makes sense why the patient ID should be in the appointment entity. But the name, the phone number, street, city, state, zip, those should all move to the patient entity, because they are all determined by the patient ID. Okay, and then lastly, the app status, that should stay in the appointment, because that is determined by the app num. So that one there is okay. So really, we just had one transitive, well, we had several transitive dependencies, but they were all dependent on the patient ID. And so you pull everything related to the patient out into this other entity, and then we've got our whole ERD in third normal form. So hopefully that's fairly clear, even without typing in all the attributes here. I think that one was a fairly easy one to understand. So let's go ahead and save this one. Homework 6-1. And we'll close it. Okay. Now let's do number 2. Okay, and I'll do this the same way. So number 2, we've got 3 entities already here. We've got attendee, we've got registration, And so the idea here is that an attendee registers for a session. And so this session is something that they attend. Maybe they hear a speaker or oh, it's a presentation. So, okay, so there's a presentation session. Okay, so let's start out looking at attendee. Okay, so attendee number is the primary key there. And then we've got the attendee's first name and last name. Those are okay. So the attendee number determines the first name and last name. I like that. Now the attendee status doesn't really have to do with the attendee. And I'll come back to it in a minute here, but it says whether or not the attendee has paid the registration fee. I don't really think that fits in the attendee entity because the attendee number doesn't necessarily determine that. You need one more piece of information. Because of the fact that the attendee can attend multiple presentations over time, they may have paid some registration fees and not paid other registration fees. So the attendee number alone doesn't determine the attendee status. Okay, so I'm going to move over to the registration entity. Looks like we've got the primary keys from the presentation entity, the foreign key from the attendee entity, and then the registration date. I think those are all good. And this is actually the place where the attendee status should be moved because the date that the attendee registered and whether or not the attendee has paid the registration fee, those are determined by the primary keys of the presentation entity and the primary key of the attendee entity. So we really need to move registration fee or not the attendee status over to the registration entity. Okay, so that's that one. Now let's look at presentation. Presentation's got, let me go ahead and draw my relationships here because I think it's important to kind of think about this. Okay. Presentation says presentation session number is a generated number uniquely identifying that session. Presentation order is a number indicating the order of presentations during the session. Now, I'm already seeing a problem here because presentation session number already on its own uniquely identifies every record in this entity. We don't need a composite primary key here. So this presentation order really doesn't need to be a primary key. It is determined by the presentation session number. So I'm taking this out of the primary key, and presentation order is going to be an attribute in presentation, but it's not going to be part of the primary key, which also means it comes out of the registration entity. So the registration entity is only going to have the presentation session number and the attendee number as the composite primary key. It's still going to have registration date and attendee status in it. Okay, back to the presentation entity. So now presentation order is no longer part of the primary key. We've got the date, the room, the title, author ID, first name, last name. Those are all good. The only thing I would say there is that it's possible that author ID could be a multi-valued attribute. So you don't necessarily have to do this, but if you wanted to, I wouldn't object to this because it is possible that an author could be in multiple presentations and each presentation could have multiple authors. So actually I'm going to pull this over here. I might say, oops, author presentation, or you could do it this way, or I mean, it doesn't really give us enough information to know. You could just say one presentation could have multiple authors and go like this, and that would be okay. Or you could connect them through this, saying that an author can be involved in multiple presentations over time, and the presentation could have multiple authors. That would be okay to me too. You could leave these entities completely off, and I'd be okay with that too. So a lot of this depends on your interpretation of what's going on in the problem, And I don't want to be too rigid in saying it has to be one way or another. But I would say that it's a possibility to have a multi-valued attribute for author ID, and so you might want to separate that out into a different entity. Okay, that's it for number 2. So let's save this one. Homework 6-2. Okay, and then the last one is number 7. So we'll skip ahead a little bit. So 7 has someone's created a database structure, but they really didn't know what they were doing. We've got the real situation, and so we've got to make sense of what's going on here. So right now, we've basically got one big, huge entity that's got everything in it, and it really doesn't make sense. We know we're going to have to separate things out. So it says, first of all, to draw the dependency diagram based on this, and it says that it has a composite primary key, and I'm guessing that the composite primary key here is the member number and the invite number, because those two together determine everything else. But it doesn't make sense to have it. Anyway, we're going to have to separate some things out. So member number on its own actually determines a lot of things. So we're going to go ahead and separate member into its own entity. And I'm going to tell you just the ones that are going to go with it. So member number is the primary key there. That unique identifier uniquely identifies the member name, the member address, city, zip code. Let's see what else. That's it. So member number, the member name, address, city, and zip code all depend on member number. And so so that needs to be pulled out, and that would be yeah, so that's a dependency we need to get rid of. Okay, now the invite is going to be another entity over here, and I'm going to throw it way over here because I know I'm going to have something in between. And the invite is going to be uniquely identified by the invite number, and the invite number uniquely identifies all the records in here, and it determines the invite date, the dinner date, I think that's it. So the invite date determines, or the invite number determines invite date. That's weird. Invite date and dinner date. And actually, I'm confusing myself here. I thought that I was I would say it also determines the dinner code and the dinner description. Okay. Well, actually, okay. It determines the dinner code, but the dinner code doesn't necessarily. Yeah, the dinner code determines the dinner description. Let's just type these in this time, because I think I'm making it more confusing than it needs to be. Okay. So I'm going to go back to member. I'm going to say member num. Oops. Member name. Let's see. We're going to give it after address. It's going to be city and then zip code. Cool. Okay. Okay. Huh. Okay. I think that works. And then the invite num is the unique identifier here. Invite date is determined by invite num. Dinner date is also determined by that. Okay. Now, I am going to go ahead and add dinner code on here. But it looks like the dinner description is actually determined by the dinner code. So we're going to have to pull out So we're going to make another entity because dinner description is determined by the dinner code. I'm going to pull that out into another entity. And say each dinner, for each dinner in here, it can be on many invites. Each invite only has one dinner. Okay. Do the same thing with entree and dessert, it looks like. In the instructions, the descriptions were a little bit weird on all these. It sounded to me like there's only one entree at each dinner. So, okay, entree code. And entree description. And add entree code here because the entree code for that dinner is uniquely identified by the invite number. And then the last, oops, this one also is a one-to-many here. And then it's the same for dessert. So I'll stick dessert over here. Okay. Dessert code. Dessert description. And that means we need to add this dessert code here. Okay. So, and I think what the book is trying to get here is it's trying to do lots of these transitive dependencies so that you have to separate them out to make it in third normal form. I think that's a little bit a little bit of a stretch to get that many transitive dependencies just with that few fields, but that's the concept that they're trying to drill in here. Okay, and the last one is going to be member invite. That's the associative relationship between these two. So each member can be invited to many dinners. Each invitation can be sent to many members. Okay. So the unique identifier here would be the combination of both member number and invite number. Okay, and the combination of those two will determine some of these other fields here or attributes. So the accept date dinner attended, I guess it's possible to accept the invitation but not actually attend, so that kind of makes sense. And that's it. So now we've got all of our dependencies correct. So member number uniquely identifies a record here, and all of these other attributes depend on member number. Here, member number and invite number uniquely identifies one record, and the accept date and dinner attended depend on both of those. In this entity over here, invite number uniquely identifies one record here, and all of the rest of these attributes depend on invite number. Dessert description depends on dessert code. Dinner description depends on dinner code, and entree description depends on entree code. So those are my dependencies. This is my ERD, and hopefully that answers number 7 well. Oops. 6, 7. Okay. So let's go ahead and close that, and that's going to be it for this explanation. So hopefully it was pretty clear. This one I think was pretty straightforward, especially given what we've done to this point. So yeah, I think it makes a lot of sense, and hopefully it was fairly easy for you guys. So thanks.